Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining today's webinar on workplace violence. We will begin our presentation in 5 minutes. Today's presentation on workplace violence will begin in 4 minutes. Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for joining in on today's webinar on workplace violence. We will begin the presentation in 2 minutes. Webinar for workplace violence will begin in 1 minute. Thank you. All right, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to ASA's safety webinar on workplace violence and harassment. I'm Michael Place, Safety and Compliance Officer for Dakota Supply Group and the Chairman of ASA's Safety Committee. Each month, the Safety Committee publishes articles and toolbox talks on a variety of safety-based subjects. These can be viewed and downloaded from the ASA website at www.asa.net. Also available on the ASA site are recordings and downloads of previous webinars. All of these items are available free to you. To view these resources, look for the Safety Resources link on the ASA homepage, which is located at www.asa.net. If you have any problems, contact Jim Kenzel at the ASA for assistance. At this time, I'd like to draw your attention to ASA's supplier partners shown on the screen. They are very important to the work we do, and the Safety Committee would like to thank them for their industry leadership and for supporting our committee in these webinars. This webinar is being recorded for later viewing. Everyone that registered for the webinar will receive an email notifying them when and where the replay of the webinar is available. Attendees will also receive an emailed link to its location. All attendees are in mute mode. To submit a question during the presentation, you can enter it in the chat box window. Before you send it, be sure your setting is set to send the question to our organizers and the panelists so we can see it. Questions will be answered at the end of the presentation as time allows. Also, an FAQ document with all questions and answers will be posted on the ASA site along with the replay of the webinar. Other related documents will be posted in that location as well. I'd now like to turn our attention to today's event. Today's webinar is presented by Gibson. Gibson is a leader in providing insurance services and risk management solutions in the United States. We are pleased to partner with Gibson in making this webinar available to our membership. Today's presentation title is Workplace Violence and Harassment. And our presenter for this webinar is Shawna Neilson. Shawna is the Director of Risk Management Services at Gibson. Her responsibilities include oversight of the claims consulting, and loss prevention teams, providing them with guidance and support for achieving their strategic goals of the agency and their clients. Shawna is responsible for the execution of new employee development, ongoing staff planning, and recruiting efforts for risk management services. A full bio of the presenter will be posted with the webinar documents on the ASA website. I'd now like to turn the presentation over to Shawna Neilson. Welcome to today's event, Shawna. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Mike, and thank you everyone for joining us for this session on workplace violence prevention. The threat of violence is a reality in the modern workplace. Each year, nearly 2 million U.S. workers report having been victims of workplace violence. Today, we will define workplace violence, discuss signs to recognize the potential for workplace violence, strategies for becoming a more effective communicator to avoid workplace violence situations, best practices for developing a workplace violence prevention program, and tactics for responding should an incident of workplace violence happen in your facility. Before we begin, please note this is not an active shooter presentation. At the end of the presentation, I will share a resource that you may wish to use in your company should you want to conduct a brief session on active shooters. The first thing most of us probably think of when we hear workplace violence is an active shooter situation. It seems we can't turn on the TV or read a newspaper or some other media outlet without hearing of some mass shooting that has occurred. While those acts are horrific, they aren't the only acts of workplace violence. Workplace violence is defined as any action meant to injure or demean others in the workplace. It is not limited to physical abuse, and in fact, it extends to verbal, sexual, and emotional abuse as well. According to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, 500 U.S. workers were workplace homicide victims in 2016 alone. Of those that died, 82% were male, 69% were between the ages of 25 and 54, and 31% worked in retail establishments. 23% were performing their duties as a protective services member. So for example, police, fire, EMTs, etc. And as tragic as 500 deaths is, another 16,890 workers experienced some form of trauma from non-fatal workplace violence. As you can see from the slide on the screen, the majority were women. 21% of the 17,000 incidents resulted in injuries that required at least 31 or more days away from work, while another 19% involved 3 to 5 days away from work. Incidents of workplace violence happen all over the world. but if we focus on just the last 3 to 4 years in the United States, we can find dozens of incidents without doing much of a deep search. This slide shows just a handful of incidents that have occurred across the U.S. The numbers following the location indicate the number dead, the number injured, and whether or not the perpetrator survived, either by taking his or her own life or by the authorities doing so. As I indicated earlier, not all instances of workplace violence involve shootings. The case listed in Salem, Massachusetts, involved a coworker stabbing another to death in a restaurant as the dinner rush was about to begin. The Glendale, Wisconsin incident involved a customer who had gotten the wrong breakfast sandwich at a fast food restaurant. So she shoved an employee, causing that employee to strike her head. In my role, I have had to counsel clients through workers' compensation claims involving coworkers having verbal disagreements that escalated into fights that have resulted in one or both parties being injured, and in some cases causing permanent injuries or death. Before I leave this slide, I do want to call your attention to the Detroit, Michigan incident. I'm not going to tell you why just right now, but we'll come back to that in just a moment. As I have continued to research and evolve this presentation about workplace violence prevention, one common theme continues to pop up, and that's bullying. If someone had told me 10 years, or even 5 years ago, that I would be talking about bullying in the context of adults, I wouldn't have believed them. As adults, we tend to think of bullying as something we may need to protect our children from. However, bullying isn't limited to children, and unfortunately, instances of adult bullying are on the rise. The definition of bullying for adults is really no different than the definition of bullying in children. It is various types of abuse repeatedly aimed at an individual or group of persons by another person or group. Adults are more likely to use verbal bullying as opposed to physical bullying. The goal of an adult bully is to gain power over another person and make him or herself the dominant adult. They often try to humiliate victims and show them who is in charge. While they may be in a true power position in the organization, they don't necessarily have to be in order to be considered a bully. So remember, I just told you I'd come back to Detroit, Michigan. One person was killed, another was injured, and the perpetrator was taken into custody. The murdered victim was reported to have consistently bullied not only the perpetrator, but countless others in the facility. I don't highlight this to give the perpetrator a pass. There's no excuse for resorting to murdering or injuring other people. I showcase this incident to note the importance of handling reports of workplace conflict timely and effectively. Statistics about workplace bullying are a little harder to come by than statistics on childhood bullying. But one source states 70% of workplace bullies are male, and 67% of the time they target females. Ironically, while only 30% of workplace bullies are reported to be females, 67% of the time they are attacking other females. Unfortunately, this statistic isn't surprising to me. If you spend any time on social media sites, you'd be amazed at the amount of shaming that women do to one another. We either not parenting correctly, we're not balancing work and home, we're the wrong size, we've slept our way to the top, you name it. That's what's said. I think you understand the point. Over 25% of adults admit to having been the victim of bullying as an adult, and 41% of those say that the bullying occurred in the workplace. Let's start talking about bullies and the habits of bullies. Political backstabbing. We're all probably familiar with office politics, strategies people play to gain advantage in the workplace. This often has a negative connotation, and rightfully so, as often those strategies involve seeking advantage through underhanded means at the expense of others. Social undermining is the expression of negative emotions directed towards a particular person or negative evaluations of the person as a way to prevent the person from achieving his or her goals. The behavior of the perpetrator is often due to feelings such as anger or dislike towards a target. The behaviors may include criticizing another's actions, their efforts, or their characteristics. Public belittling is a way of making someone else seem less important than yourself. Bullies will go out of their way to point out what they perceive as inferior qualities in their target. I have seen this in the form of a coworker getting their hands on another coworker's high school pictures and using those pictures to make fun of and mock that person in front of others. Ostracism is excluding one from social acceptance, privileges, friendship. Generally, we spend 40 hours plus per week with our coworkers, and most of us are assuming we'll make social connections in the workplace. Goes out of his or her way, sure to exclude an individual or individuals. Lastly, hazing is often a habit of bullies. Hazing is the practice of rituals, challenges, and other activities involving harassment, abuse, or humiliation to initiate a person into a group. Now, most of us are probably thinking of hazing in the context of fraternities, sororities, and sports teams. However, hazing happens in work environments as well and should be watched for and stopped immediately. After one session of training on this topic, I had a manager tell me of her practice. She would regularly hire interns, and when introducing the interns to the others in the office, this manager would ask the intern to wear a tutu and a helmet. This helmet is similar to something Vikings would wear, complete with the horns. This manager did this under the guise that it was building team camaraderie. She said they were always more than willing to do it. So when she finished explaining herself to me, I asked her one simple question. What exactly do you think an intern on their first day in a new job is going to tell their manager when asked this? Let that sink in for just a second. I would ask each of you, as you're listening, think about ways, perhaps you or others in your organization may be trying to build team camaraderie. And in doing so, is it in the true spirit of what you're intending, or is it to make that person seem smaller than you are? Remember, if you wouldn't want to go through it, it's probably something that shouldn't be put onto others. Anton Hout, founder of OvercomeBullying.org, has identified the most common bully types. So let's start with the easiest type of bully to recognize, the screaming Mimi. According to Anton, this type of bully is very loud, contradictory, and often abusive. They will rarely think twice about publicly insulting or humiliating another person. And the more reaction they get, the worse their behavior will often become. Remember that this type of bully is probably very aware that others dislike them and will actually be encouraged by the fact that others are scared of them. The two-headed snake. This one's much sneakier than the first type of bully. This is the kind of person who will in secret talk ill of a coworker, discredit their reputation, and even try to quietly take credit for their work. But to a coworker's face, this kind of bully will often act like a close friend and a supportive colleague. So look out for somebody who is acting one way when around a person, but the opposite way when out of earshot. A person's work is never good enough, according to the constant critic. Their goal is to undermine the confidence of others by criticizing almost everything they do. And sure, some amount of constructive criticism can be a good thing. But to the constant critic, everything can be improved. And they will not hesitate to point this out. But it doesn't stop with just pointing out every minor imperfection. If there's nothing to criticize, the constant critic is not adverse to the idea of making things up with the sole purpose of making another person look bad. According to Anton, the gatekeeper really loves having power over resources that other people need. Whether it's as simple as refusing to lend somebody a pen, or as serious as purposefully preventing somebody's access to work-critical systems. The gatekeeper will always be on the lookout for ways to deny people the tools they need. Remember, too, that the kind of resources the gatekeeper will try to control aren't always physical. They can include soft resources like time and information. The attention seeker. Instead of wanting to feel powerful or dominant, this person wants one simple thing: attention. And they'll likely go to great lengths to get it. This includes brown-nosing their superiors in a bid for preferential treatment, or excessive flattery towards their colleagues and peers. Until they are denied the attention they crave, they might even appear to be model employees. But be careful. If they don't get the attention they need, they can easily turn nasty. The wannabe. Anton describes this type of workplace bully as the most petty and spiteful of them all. They think that they are the best thing since sliced bread and want to be recognized for that. And here's the thing: they aren't usually very good at their job. Look out for somebody who exhibits behavior similar to the constant critic, but who does so in a less relentless but more intense manner. Also look for somebody who always wants to be right about everything, and who seems to be automatically against anybody else's way of doing something, even if it's clear that it's a better way of doing it. The guru. The problem with this type of bully is that as far as their actual work quality and performance goes, they're the ideal employee. Highly skilled in a specific area of work, and generally a genuinely valuable contribution to the company's operations. However, Anton explains that the guru is a bully whose skills are counterbalanced by their lack of emotional maturity. They will likely be very aware of their much-needed skill set, and as such, will feel as if they are above the regular rules that apply to their coworkers, and will be unlikely to take responsibility for their actions when things do go wrong. The sociopath. Possibly the most damaging type of bully of them all, the sociopath is described by Anton as being intelligent, charming, persuasive, and even charismatic. Seems to be a model person, right? Unfortunately, this type of bully will actually have no empathy for others and will be very well practiced in toying with the emotions of their coworkers and manipulating them for their own personal gain. Oops. As I referenced earlier, if you're a parent, your first instinct is likely to think of your children when we talk about bullying. Cyberbullying is also rampant with adults, although most statistics reference teen cyberbullying. By definition, cyberbullying is using electronic technology to do the bullying. With social media sites such as Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and Snapchat, adults are some of the worst perpetrators of cyberbullying, as can be seen by this snapshot of tweets that took place a couple of years ago. An important part of preventing workplace violence is to have a strong social media policy. Just a few weeks ago, I had a client ask for assistance with developing their social media policy as they had been contacted by someone outside their company. This individual had seen a racist post on one of my client's employees' Facebook pages and tracked it back to my client. They wanted to know if the opinion expressed by this employee was also the opinion of the company. The laws around what employers can and cannot do around employees' use of social media are constantly evolving. But you should have something in place so you can protect your employees and your company's brand. Now, we spent a lot of time talking about the habits and types of bullies because there's a strong link between bullying and violence. Studies show that both victims of and bullies themselves are more likely to engage in violent behavior. While we have focused on the traits of adult bullies, remember, they didn't wake up one day and become a bully. Bullying is a learned behavior and can be linked to severe physical punishments used at home, lack of parental involvement, and a lack of knowledge about positive ways to deal with problems. In the next few slides, we will see there are some common traits to look for to recognize the signs of a potential perpetrator of workplace violence. Please note, these are not intended to be a diagnostic tool. If you feel an employee or coworker is portraying any of these signs, it's an opportunity to have a discussion to make sure everything is okay. And depending upon the situation and circumstances, perhaps remind them of your employee assistance program should you have one. I do truly believe if we would offer a bit of kindness when we see someone else is struggling, that we could likely prevent some instances of workplace violence. As we look at some common traits that have been found in perpetrators of workplace violence, remember, you know your coworkers. Consider that normally happy-go-lucky person as having a baseline. If you see changes in behavior that are more than just a day or two, that's likely when you want to consider talking with company officials in the hopes of getting the person help. Some common traits include increased usage of drugs or alcohol, increased and/or severe mood swings, outbursts of anger or rage, decreased attention to personal appearance or hygiene, resistance to or disregarding of policies and procedures, paranoid behavior, speaks of violence, firearms, weapons, or violent crimes, or shows empathy towards those that commit violent acts, increased talk of personal, financial, or domestic issues, or has increased absences with vague or no explanation, seems depressed or withdrawn, or has unstable or over-emotional reaction, talks of suicide or preparing for death. I can't emphasize this enough. These are by no means intended to be a diagnostic tool. I'm going to assume that none of us listening today are medically qualified to make a diagnosis. But what we can do is look for signs of behaviors that are uncharacteristic of an individual that last for more than a couple of days. That doesn't mean we assume the person is going to become violent, but we do want to report the concern to our Human Resources Department or other designated company representative. The goal is that someone show the person compassion, checking in to see if something has changed in the person's life that perhaps can be addressed either by handling employment matters or offering assistance through an employee assistance program. The media often portrays the perpetrator of a violent act as someone who went postal or just snapped. We never saw it coming. At the time of a violent act, there is often speculation as to what triggered it. But more often than one would expect, there were no warning signs. So imagine if we could prevent an act of violence by following these 5 universal truths of human interaction. People feel the need to be respected. I think that one's pretty self-explanatory. None of us wants to go around and feel disrespected by others. People would rather be asked than told, and people have a desire to know why. As an inexperienced manager early in my career, I failed at those 2. I wrongfully thought that people should do what I said because of my title. I didn't have to explain why. Thankfully, I learned fairly early that was not the way to lead people. I wanted to be asked and told why when my manager asked something of me. Shoot, today I still do. So why shouldn't I treat the people I was leading the same way? People prefer to have options. This one can be a little tougher. But if you can address a situation, giving them viable options that you can live with. Maybe it's not 100% the perfect process that you were thinking about, but you can live with it. You will ultimately have a happier workforce. And isn't that a win-win? And people want to have a second chance. Since this is a webinar, I can't ask for a show of hands. But I want you to ask yourselves, and I'm going to ask you all right now, who here listening today hasn't made a mistake in your career? I'm guessing none of you will raise your hand. We've all made mistakes, but hopefully the mistakes we have made have been learning lessons and not a career ender. And don't get me wrong with any of these items. I'm not suggesting you ignore habitual problem people, people who may be cancerous for your organization, etc. But these 5 basic principles about human interaction are a framework to help us learn to communicate with one another more effectively. Communication is the root cause of so many issues. Misunderstandings can lead to hurt feelings and bad relationships, but even worse, can lead to workplace violence if left unhandled. And we communicate with so much more than our words. In fact, only 10% of our messages are the words we speak. 40% of our message is the voice we use, our tone, our pace, and our pitch. You'll find today as I'm speaking to you, I'm pausing when I want to be sure you've caught a point, or I'm raising or I'm lowering my voice to draw attention to a particular item. You can't see my body language, but my hands are extremely animated as I'm talking with you today. And that's 50% of our message. So as the image here shows, this young lady is completely shut down to her coworker. There's no eye contact. Her arms are crossed. I guarantee she's not truly hearing a word he's saying. There are a number of barriers to communication. Is the environment you are in so noisy that it's hard to hear and understand what is being said? Assumptions and misconceptions based upon real or perceived differences can lead one to react poorly to a situation. Emotions can play a huge part. How often have you been involved in a conversation with someone about a topic that you are extremely passionate about? That passion can be mistaken for anger or frustration with the person rather than being understood as your energy about the topic. You have to be aware of that with yourself and as others are communicating with you. Language differences can be a huge barrier to effective communication. Varying foreign dialects can make it difficult to find an appropriate interpreter when trying to communicate with coworkers that speak a different language. And lastly, poor listening skills. You've probably had at least one conversation with a coworker or manager who isn't even looking up from whatever they're doing and giving you the obligatory and head nod from time to time. You know they aren't truly listening to you, and you know how that makes you feel. If you're in a position in your organization to provide training or suggest that your organization undergo training, we're going to jump into a concept to help you with this known as LEAPS. Listen, empathize, ask, paraphrase, summarize. Bear with me 1 second here as the PowerPoint seems to have frozen up. Jim or Jen, if you are there, we are having some technical difficulties with the PowerPoint. Thank you. Go back one slide, please. There we go. Thank you. Verbal Judo, The Gentle Art of Persuasion is a book by Dr. George Thompson. The basic concept is to develop better communication and relationships through empathy. We're going to quickly cover the 5 pieces to give you a flavor of what Dr. Thompson's book suggests are the key to more effective communication. So we have to start with listening. To effectively communicate, we have to look and act like we are actually listening to the other person. As I stated earlier, if you try to talk to a coworker or a supervisor who doesn't even look at you, do you feel like they are really listening to you? And have any of you been to a Chick-fil-A restaurant lately? They actually have cardboard boxes on the tabletop, challenging you to place your cell phones in that box until your meal is complete. In my team meetings here at Gibson, I have asked my team members to place their phones on silent and turn them over so they can't see the screen light up or the other notifications that pop up when they get a new email or a text or some other item. Try to apply this concept in your environment to ensure you are giving the person trying to speak with you your full attention. And remember, to be a good listener, we aren't already processing our rebuttal to whatever the other person is saying. We are focused on hearing their words, reading their tone, their pace, and their pitch, and reading their body language. Empathize. Try to put yourself in the other person's shoes and understand where they are coming from. Critically important, this does not mean you have to agree or disagree. Don't stir the pot if you don't have to. This is just letting them know that you do understand what they've said and the point they've tried to make. Most people just want to feel that they have truly been heard, and empathizing with them can show that you have. Too often we get caught up in agreeing, which stirs the pot, or disagreeing, which starts a fight. We don't have to do either one of those. They just need to know that they've been heard. Once we've listened and let them know we did hear them, we may need to ask questions to help further understand. Asking is a fact-finding mission. And for those of you that have been through root cause analysis training, it's trying to get to the bottom of what the person is really trying to tell you. Not everyone can speak eloquently and truly express what they mean on the first try, especially if it's something they are passionate about or that has really been bothering them. When you're asking for specifics, you must do so without steering them to your point of view on the topic. You're seeking to better understand their position and trying to determine what solutions they may already have in mind for the problem. If they come up with the solution and you can live with that solution, you're going to be better off every single time. Paraphrase. Now we're going to paraphrase what we think we heard. Using your own words, tell them what you heard. This should hopefully show them you've been listening, unless you get it all wrong. So make sure we're doing those first 3 steps right. It's also giving you control of the situation because you're now the one talking. And once you have expressed what you think you heard, give them the opportunity to clear up any misunderstandings you may have expressed. After going through the other steps, hearing any rebuttals they may have to your paraphrasing, and uncovering potential solutions, it's time to summarize the conversation. As you're doing this, it should sound as though you've reached the end of all that can be done in this conversation, and it's coming to a close. This doesn't mean that you can't let them know you've heard them and you need to vet out further solutions, obtain approval to implement a solution, or have some other unresolved piece from the conversation. Maybe you need to come back together and talk about it in a week. It simply means you aren't going to allow the conversation to be rehashed over and over and over again in that moment. If you haven't been able to resolve the situation fully during this process, it is critical to let the person know what outstanding items there are, whose responsibility it is to follow through on those items, and when you will reconvene to address them. Perhaps the most critical piece is the follow-through. Failure to do so will result in the person losing trust in you, which, as we all know, is very hard to regain. Ideally, before an instance of workplace violence occurs, you will have a plan in place. Everyone listening today should check their OSHA program manual to see if it contains an emergency action plan that includes a workplace violence prevention plan. If it doesn't, it can easily be added to your programs. This is also a good time to remind everyone that your OSHA program manual should be reviewed at a minimum annually to ensure your plans are current. Do you have a workplace violence prevention policy in your employee handbook that details your expectations of employees in the event of a potential situation? And have you communicated it? This policy should detail who an employee is to contact in the event they receive or overhear threatening communications from another employee or third party. It should also have a statement regarding confidentiality, letting the reporting party know that the report will be kept confidential only to the extent that it can be, meaning there may be a few people in the organization that need to be notified of the situation. Many instances of workplace violence are the result of a domestic dispute that spills over into the workplace. In at least 2 of the workplace violence scenarios you saw listed early in this webinar, the violent act was perpetrated by someone that didn't work with the victims. Do you have a culture that encourages employees to talk to human resources if there is a domestic situation going on? Or does your handbook address that an employee should let a designated company person know if there is a restraining or other protective order in place? And do you have a plan on what to do should someone advise you of this? Knowing of the potential risk allows you to be proactive and take steps to ensure the safety of all of your employees. Steps may include asking the employee if they have obtained a protective or restraining order and having a copy of it on hand in case the police need to be called. Providing a picture of the potential assailant to the receptionist so he or she can be on alert for the person. Perhaps even putting your facility on lockdown. and reminding your employees what to do in the event violence does take place on the premises. If a workplace violence incident does occur, having a response plan is critical. Your plan should include procedures for calling for help, medical assistance, and the proper authorities to respond, emergency evacuation procedures and routes, safe places to escape inside and outside the facility, procedures to communicate with and account for all employees in the event of an evacuation, key personnel and their responsibilities in the event of an incident, including who is permitted to speak with the media. That piece often gets missed. Regular review and updates to the plan. It is so vitally important that you train and educate your employees of the potential signs of workplace violence, as well as the procedures your company is to follow in the event an incident occurs. A couple of other items to just briefly touch on regarding this topic include the potential purchase of a workplace violence insurance policy. There are a few insurance companies that offer this product, and depending upon the coverage limits desired, can often be purchased for a few $1,000s. The benefits of such a policy include pre-incident coverage for items such as hiring security in the event of a potential threat, as well as post-incident coverage for items that are not covered by a standard property policy. For example, in the event of a tragedy in your facility, counselors may encourage you to try to change something about the area where the incident occurred. This is to help your employees deal with the violent act without having to relive it every day because the area looks the same as when the incident occurred. This could be completely a makeover, if you will. If the area didn't sustain true physical damage, your property policy isn't going to cover the makeover. But a workplace violence insurance policy may include some coverage for this. Another item to be aware of or consider is the implementation of an employee assistance program. An employee assistance program is available typically upon a per employee, per month fee basis. Benefits include counseling services for employees to help them work through personal or professional difficulties, which may help prevent an incident from carrying over into the workplace. Another benefit often included is crisis response. So if you already have an EAP in place, your provider may respond to aid in counseling and communication with your employees after an incident occurs. And should an incident occur and you don't have an employee assistance program, you can still contact a vendor that provides this type of crisis response and contract with them for post-incident response. Some workplace violence insurance policies will even cover the cost of this post-incident response. So we've covered what workplace violence and bullying are, as well as what some of the potential signs are. Please remember, those signs are not meant to be used as a diagnostic tool. We have spent time learning about effective communication and how to use LEAPs. Listen, empathize, ask, paraphrase, and summarize, in the hopes of keeping difficult conversations and confrontations from escalating into something violent. And we've just finished discussing the importance of having a workplace violence prevention program, handbook, and a handbook policy in place. Now, as I promised at the beginning of the webinar, this final slide contains resources related to active shooter situations. The first website links to the LA County Sheriff's active shooter video. It's about a 9.5-minute video that addresses how employees should respond in an active shooter situation. I have been all over the internet trying to find good videos on this topic, and this is one of the best put together videos, and actually still gives me chills to this day when I watch it. So I really encourage you to check out that link and go check out that video. The other two links are resources to help you develop your emergency action plan, including the workplace violence response. So I thank you for your time and attention during this presentation. So let's see if there are any questions we need to address.
Shawna, thank you. Very insightful. We do have a couple questions here, so I'll just start with the first one. I know in cases dealing with reasonable suspicion, only those that have been trained on reasonable suspicion are recommended to observe and document those types of cases in the workplace. Is it the same way with workplace violence and harassment? In other words, Is there a training requirement in order to become authorized to document these types of incidents?
The short answer on that, Mike, is no. There is not the same as reasonable suspicion around drug and alcohol use. That is why I emphasize throughout this that there are potential signs of someone that could potentially, perpetuate an act of workplace violence. We're not qualified to make that medical diagnosis, nor is there training out there or some certification that you can get that makes you qualified, short of being obviously a medical provider. So in the workplace, I just always tell my clients to look out for, so if people know Shawna, as I'm speaking, and they know how I am, and I normally come in and I'm good morning to everybody and all is great, they know that about me. If I come in one day and my head's down and I'm like, ooh, I'm fit for tide, they probably think I just got into a fight with my husband. But if I do that day after day after day, that's the quote unquote reasonable suspicion to go report it to someone if you're not good enough friends with that person to say, hey, what's going on?
Sure.
Does that answer that for you, Mike?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. We do have, it looks like, one more question that's popped up here. If I find weapons in the facility but do not know who they belong to, how do I go about addressing the situation with my workforce?
First thing I would do is, to the extent possible, secure that location wherever they've been found. I'm not recommending that anyone just grab them and go lock them into a drawer when I say that. I would call the authorities, probably the non-emergency line versus calling 911. Unless, of course, you think you found a bomb. Then, of course, I would call 911 and get everybody out of there. But if I found weapons in the facility, I would get a hold of the authorities to come get them out. I would then, from whatever practice, whether you have the ability to email all of your folks, if you're in an office environment, if you're in a manufacturing type setting, and the folks don't have email, I would pull everyone off the floor and say, look, we have found these weapons. They're not to be here. To my knowledge, and I have to be very careful because I realize that your group is far spanning here. I think most employers still have the right to say you can't have the weapons in the facility. Can't keep them out of their cars in the parking lot necessarily, and those laws vary by state. But bringing your people together and reminding them of what your policy is on the weapons. I would have the authorities confiscate them, get them out of there, remind your people, and then I would keep a really close, watchful eye. Chances are somebody's going to know who brought them in, and if we let our people know we found them, we knew they were here, we're taking appropriate measures. If you've got anything else to go with it versus just finding weapons, maybe someone has reported to HR that Shawna's been a little distant. We're afraid she might go off the deep end. Might be the time to consider hiring security to come in and look through things. It's going to vary depending upon the situation that's going on, whether or not you've had any issues with other people complaining that somebody's kind of been a little out there, a little off, a little not their self.
And I do have one more question here. You had referenced the LA department and the video, and I see you have that slide up here on the screen. Are there agencies that provide in-person active shooter or emergency response services for bullying and workplace violence? And
yeah, so a lot. Yes, sorry to cut you off there, Mike. A lot of your local law enforcement, state police, both city, county, state will offer those services to come in and train your people, especially on active shooter. That's why we don't do it. We're really not qualified to do true active shooter training. If you're looking for, though, something that's not just active shooter, you're probably not going to get that training from your local authorities. And again, that's going to vary by different districts. So that's not intended as a sort of a slam to our various law enforcement officials. But most of them are going to have an officer or two that can come in and do active shooter training. Be aware you need to get on their schedules when their time's going to permit. They've got day jobs to keep us all safe. But if you truly want like conflict resolution, that sort of a thing versus the active shooter, you're probably going to have to go to some other kind of a consultant to get it.
Thank you, Shawna. And that looks like all the questions that we have here. So.
Oh, hey, Mike, we got some more questions.
Okay, Jim, I'll turn it on over to you.
First off, somebody has asked the question. First off, just a reminder, if anybody has any more questions, please be sure to enter it in the chat area so we can see the questions. And there was one question about, just to make sure everybody's aware, as Mike said at the beginning of the presentation, the question was asked if the presentation will be available, and the answer is yes. It'll be available in a recorded version, and all people who were involved will get a link to that presentation following the live presentation. Shawna, one of the questions we got was basically asking if you could go over what should be included in a workforce violence prevention program.
I can tell you, I can do one better for you. I can give you guys some samples to link to. How's that sound?
That would be great.
My guess is that would probably answer the person's question. So
my guess is I'm going to give them the policy. They just need to tweak. So a couple of those things that I did talk about there when I talked about the workplace violence prevention program, the handbook policy, those things, we do have samples available. And I apologize that I did not state that when I was talking to the slides. So I would be more than happy. I will shoot those over to you. And then as you guys are doing the link to this webinar, if you want to add that to it, you're more than happy to share those.
Great. Mike, that's all the questions I've got on my end.
Okay. Well, I don't see any other questions. So first and foremost, Shawna, thank you for taking the time and helping us and our membership on this important topic. And thank you to all for attending today's webinar. In the near future, you will receive an email directing you to a replay of the webinar and the associated documents. Also, watch your email for announcements about future webinars. We will have more from the ASA coming this year. Be sure to visit the ASA website at www.asa.net. There is a link for safety to find a variety of great information. We appreciate everybody's participation today. Thank you for joining, and have a safe day, everyone.
Mike, before we lose everybody, I just wanted to do a quick plug. If you are anybody on the presentation, if your company is an ASA member and you are a part of or are the person responsible for safety and environmental health in the company, we'd love to hear from you. We'd love to get your name in our database. So because we do periodically send out safety notices and updates from OSHA and notices like this webinar presentation. So if you're not in our database, please contact me at the email shown on the slide, and we'll get you in there. If you are interested in participating on the ASA Safety Committee, we encourage you to consider joining. It gives you the opportunity to get involved with other safety professionals on once-a-month calls, and gives you in the getting involved in writing articles, setting up presentations, dealing with issues that are coming out of OSHA, and in many ways being the voice of the industry when it comes to safety. So we encourage you to consider that, and if you do, let me know. So with that, and along with Mike and everybody else, we'll finish this out and say thank you for participating. Thank you, Shawna.
Thank you.
Have a great day, everyone.